Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Hey, podcast listeners, want to stay informed without the daily email overload? Sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Every Tuesday morning, we bring you the top local stories, plus highlights from Idaho Matters and the Mountain West News Bureau, all in one easy read. Stay in the know without the clutter. Subscribe now at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It was 1 year ago when two of the most destructive fires in California history broke out in Los Angeles County. 31 people died and tens of thousands of homes were destroyed.
Santa Ana winds pounded the city of Los Angeles on January 7th, 2025.
Doing structure defense. Looks like the fire is going to hit the back of these houses in about 5-10 minutes. Our mission right now is life safety. EVAC is our concern.
I've never seen fire behavior like that in 39 years.
Sunset is impassable. We have fire impacting Sunset Boulevard.
People just abandoning their cars and walking towards the ocean for safety.
But as many ran for their lives, another group of people were running towards that fire.
We don't look at wildfire as an enemy, but that it's a natural reality.
They're on a mission to teach residents how to live better with wildfire.
Everybody acknowledges the risk, but to accept it and to do something about it is a different story.
We've seen how this story usually ends: death and destruction, not just in California, but all over the globe. Wildfires are becoming more intense, more frequent, and more unpredictable. Our cities are simply not built to withstand these hurricanes of fire.
That house is gone, that house is gone, that house is gone.
Yeah, wait till you see this.
But can there be a different ending to this story?
This house survived.
This house survived because of the work of this group of civilians, known as the Community Brigade. But they didn't do it by fighting the flames.
So how did they do it? That's the story of a new podcast called Palisades Fire, where reporter and host Adriana Cargill looks at a group of misfit surfers who created the Community Brigade pilot program. This is where everyday people train and work with professional firefighters to change how communities live with wildfire. Adriana came on the show more than 2 years ago to talk about her Sandcastles podcast, where she introduced us to this brigade. And now she's back to talk about how the Palisades Fire gave those surfers their first big test. Adriana, it's good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So take us back 2.5 years ago when you came on our program and you talked about this group of truly misfit surfers and their story during the 2018, I believe it was the Woolsey Fire, correct, in Malibu?
Yep, the Woolsey Fire. Yeah, so just right off the bat, the Santa Monica Mountains and Malibu area is a fire landscape. There has been wildfires there for thousands of years, and the Native Americans who lived there and the early European settlers learned to live with wildfire and coexist with it. And there's always been this tradition of people who stay and defend in this area, going back hundreds of years. And I think this group of surfers really is kind of building on this tradition that was before. But as times have changed, as wildfires have gotten worse, they've gotten more frequent, more unpredictable, more intense, as we saw with the Palisades and Eaton Fire. The Community Brigade model really kind of built on the tradition and the history of this place, but kind of bringing it into a more formalized and more connected community effort to live better with wildfire.
So what's happened since we last had you on the show?
Yeah, so when I left off with the original Sandcastles podcast, the Community Brigade program was just an idea. It didn't exist in reality. And since then, they actually got it approved in 2023 as a pilot program with the LA County Fire Department, which It's one of the best wildfire fighting operations on the planet. And so they really started developing the curriculum. They recruited their first class of 50 people, working with a ton of nonprofits. And then in 2024, they trained their first group of about 50 volunteers. And then in January 2025, almost a year ago, the Palisades Fire hit, and that was their first big test.
So let's stop right there and play a little bit more from your new podcast where you were doing interviews with fire officials. So let's take a listen to this.
When I left Station 70 in Malibu on that day nearly 3 years ago, I felt a chill driving home through Topanga and the Palisades. The station is on the Pacific Coast Highway, or PCH. There's tons of homes along the PCH. Was it possible they could all burn? Unlikely, I thought, but it's always been a shadow in my mind ever since. And on January 6, 2025, my phone buzzed. LA City emergency alert. Red flag conditions predicted. Winds could reach 80 to 100 miles per hour in certain areas. My heart dropped. I thought immediately about Keegan and the brigade.
So what were you thinking when you saw these fires break out? I mean, truly in your own backyard last January.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the wind speeds on that red flag alert, I was just like, oh man, it's not a question of if there are going to be fires, it's where and when you're dealing with those kind of winds. And so, I immediately thought about the Community Brigade because I knew they existed. I knew they were trained up. I knew they were ready to go. But I wondered, like, are they ready for a day like this? Like these, the National Weather Service was saying this was critically bad, extreme, wildfire warnings. And at the same time, I thought, what if the model works? Like, what if they're able to save homes and lives? Like, what if this is the moment where things start to shift? And this could be really big in how we live with wildfires. So I was kind of holding those two tensions, kind of feeling this sense of dread, but also thinking this could be hugely impactful in a positive way if this model works.
Can you take us back and describe to us what you saw during and after the fires?
One of the things that's always impacted me the most about wildfires is the air quality. And I think people talked about that a lot. When you step out of your house and you can't breathe the air, it's just this, I feel like so helpless. Like, like how can I change the air? And then I'm hearing about, my friends' houses that are burning down. And there's just this sense of like dread and powerlessness. And, that's something that I think marked a lot of people who lived in LA's experience of those fires. It was a really gnarly time.
Yeah. So the Community Brigade, the Community Brigade, it actually sprang into action a year ago when these fires happened. What are the three main things that they did?
Yeah, I think so. Their reason for being is to save homes and lives. They want to prevent mass destruction from wildfires and lives lost. When there's an incident, LA County gives them orders, and immediately within an hour of the fire starting, their orders were to do evacuations. And that's what they spent the majority of the fire doing, is focusing on that. And by their count, they evacuated hundreds of residents, and a lot of them were people who were unprepared, unaware, or elderly or disabled, which, as we saw in both the Palisades and Eaton fires, are the majority of people who were killed by the fire. And the second thing they did was structure triage. So they want to save homes. And now, in the moment when there's a fire incident, it's really limited what you can do. So what they're doing is mostly pulling combustibles, anything that could burn like away from your house. If you have pool furniture, if you have big bushes, if you have wooden fences that could easily be moved or opened, those are kind of quick last minute things they can do. And then the other thing is, in terms of what's important for them is just making sure that all of their community brigade members are safe. And so that's having constant communication, having group think, and just making sure that people are following a lot of the guardrails that they have in order to keep them safe.
I want to play another clip from the new podcast, The Palisades Fire, where the Community Brigade is trying to save a home.
Ready for water. Water coming.
The brigader's in someone's backyard, and he's getting into what looks like a crouched defensive position, with a hose between the house and a wall of flames. And the wind was out of control.
I saw helmets flying, and I remember seeing trash cans just lifted in the air, just flying down the street.
This clip is from around that time. You can see a recycling bin being blown down the street, and aluminum cans are flying everywhere. That's that metal noise you can hear. Smoke that's a sickly yellowish gray is billowing overhead. It's coming over houses like smoke bursting out of a rocket as it takes off.
I remember one time I opened my truck door and it just ripped it out of my hand, and the thing bent back and my whole truck leaned over, and I was like, oh no. I thought literally it was going to bend and break the hinge off my door because it violently swung open so hard right out of my hands.
That was impressive, Gus.
Reporter and host Adriana Cargill is still with us, and I do want to point out that she not only covered this fire, she actually also lives in Southern California. And I'm curious, Adriana, what it was like to be in the middle of this, because I think sometimes it's kind of hard to separate yourself when maybe you weren't, directly impacted. But as you mentioned earlier, I mean, you had friends who were going through this.
Yeah, you're watching your community be destroyed in real time. And the places that I go surfing, the places that I hike, where my friends live, there was evacuations in Monica, and I live in the neighborhood next to Santa Monica. And so it was right in your face. But at the same time, I also am seeing so much community level care. One of the big things in the immediate aftermath of the fire was all of the GoFundMe pages where you really saw people, helping their community members. And there were tons of volunteers, working in food banks and clothing banks. And it was just the amount of emotions. It was quite the roller coaster. You're seeing this horrible devastation, but you're also seeing this beautiful coming together of your community. So it was a very wild time.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Can you also tell us the story about this one house that you talk about in your podcast that actually survived the fires?
Yeah, Keegan, when I caught up with him, in the days after the initial fire front, and, I kept asking the question, do you think the model succeeded? Do you think it worked? And, how would you explain that to people? And one of the big things that the brigade does when there isn't an incident, so let's say there's not a wildfire for a few years, they're still meeting every month doing trainings. They have new classes, new groups of brigaders that start and go through training. But a huge thing that they do is something called a home ignition assessment. And they'll go to any resident's house for free as volunteers, and they'll give an assessment of, what might prevent your home from igniting during a wildfire, because 90% of homes actually burn from embers and not the fire front. And so ember proofing your house is essential. And so he kept telling me, there's these houses that we had done these home assessments on. And, I want to take you to one that survived. And it was this house at the end of a cul-de-sac. There used to be 4 houses there. And you kind of come up the cul-de-sac. It's like this little knob of land. The Santa Monica Mountains are right behind it. It's, right at the urban wildland interface, which is called the WUI. And this is kind of, like the highest risk fire zone to be in. And you come up this driveway, and all the other houses are rubble, and they're in the exact same area. There was no fire support there. And then you see this fourth house that they did the home assessment on. The homeowner actually did the changes, and there are literally purple flowers in the front yard and birds of paradise flowers, and there's not a burn mark on the whole house. Like, if you were to look at that house, it's almost like it was copy and pasted from a normal neighborhood into a disaster zone where there was a war or a bombing. It really is quite striking.
That had to have been wild to see with your own eyes.
Yeah, because, I have followed the Community Brigade as it's developed over the years. And, Keegan's been telling me about the home ignition zone principles, which come from the fire scientist, Dr. Jack Cohen, who's based in Colorado. And he's been researching this for 30 years, how homes ignite. And I thought, okay, sure. Like, during extreme fire events, this isn't going to matter. And looking at this house, I was like, wow, like this actually is it. Like, these very small changes that this homeowner made the difference between their house still being exactly as it was before the fire and every other house around it gone.
I want to go back to the night as the brigade evacuated home after home during the fires. Let's take a listen to this.
We saw a guy just standing in the middle of the road. What are you doing, sir? He's like, just watching the fire. I'm like, are you getting out of here? What's your plan? He's like, no, I'm going to stay. And his house was in a really bad area with a ton of big pine trees all over his house. And I said, I really think that's a really bad idea. I really suggest you leave. And he's like, should I get my wife and my kid out of here? I'm like, absolutely. They need to leave immediately.
He tells them he lost a home in Woolsey, and they should video every room and everything in it to prepare to lose it.
And then he's like, well, my two neighbors are staying too in this same steep driveway. I said, okay, we'll go talk to them. We go to one of the neighbors' house. There was 3 or 4 cars in the driveway at this house. We walk up to the door, start banging on the door. All the lights are out. Banging on the door. Fire department, shining our flashlight in there. Nobody answers the door. Like, okay, well, I guess maybe they left, wherever, and we're walking back to the car, and all of a sudden we hear the door open. We turn around, and there's this guy in his, like, had to have been in his late 80s or something, basically wearing his pajamas, no shoes, and he'd clearly just woken up. Hey, sir, are you getting out of here? He said, oh, why? Should I? I don't even think we even said anything. We just paused and just stared at him, turned around, and looked at the whole ridge that's on fire that's heading towards us. We said, absolutely. You need to get out of here. He said, it's dangerous? Absolutely. Okay. Well, nobody told me. I didn't know to leave. I didn't get any notifications. The power's out. It's like he probably doesn't have backups. His cell phone probably doesn't even work. He's probably not even signed up for stuff. He's in his 80s, and that's a huge part of the problem right now with evacuation notifications.
I asked if his house survived.
Yeah, and miraculously that house survived. But the first house, the guy with his wife and his kid, was lost.
All brigade members who did evacuations had stories like this. People unaware, people refusing to leave, people completely unprepared. By their count, they evacuated hundreds of residents.
So the brigade obviously saved lives, but can we really measure, Adriana, how big of a difference the brigade made during these fires?
Yeah, this is a tough question to answer. And, I think that the work that they do before a fire, during a fire, and after, taken all together, I would argue it as someone who's been watching this for years, it absolutely makes a difference. But, there are 50 people operating in a few neighborhoods. And I think a lot of the potential is what if there were more community brigade members? What if there were more community brigades in different neighborhoods, in different cities? If this thing were to be scaled, which the founders have always seen this as a template, like they want other places that are high risk fire zones to be able to use this model they designed to help their own communities. And I think, with scale, we would see a lot, but I also just want to reiterate that it is an experiment. It is something that's still evolving and still iterating, but in the bigger conversation around wildfire solutions, it's almost always top-down approaches. It's institutional change, like, let's change the codes, let's change the zoning, let's bury the energy infrastructure, let's have a statewide ban on this material. These type of solutions are very slow and very difficult to do. And I think the Community Brigade is really pointing the way of, hey, what about change from bottom up? What can residents do? What can everyday people do? And, I think if many people in a community were to do home hardening, you create this sort of herd immunity, which the neighborhood can actually begin to protect itself. And, if people are organized and educated about wildfires, they may evacuate sooner. They may be more prepared. Their house may be ember-proofed, and so the house is lost. So I think, this is an experiment, but it would be very interesting to see what would happen if this model were used in many places during the next fire.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because this brigade is a result of a lot of work and training in a specific area in California. We're in Idaho, but we also have the same fire dangers happening and that urban interface going on. So how is this story relevant here to Idaho and Idahoans?
Yeah, I mean, the home ignition zone principles that Dr. Jack Cohen, who's a retired U.S. Forest Service fire scientist, those principles can be used anywhere. And he principally works in Colorado, for example. And if we frame the problem as we don't have a wildfire problem, we have a home ignition problem, then we start to get to a place where homeowners and residents can really take an active role in protecting their own properties. And when I say home ignition zone and these home hardening principles, it's stuff like put 1/8-inch mesh over your attic fence so embers can't get in. It's, instead of having wood chips around your house, have river pebbles or stones. You don't have to get rid of all the vegetation around your house, but maybe plant species that, have a higher moisture content and don't burn as easily. It's this kind of everyday stuff, that small changes that can really make a big difference. And this is the kind of stuff that the homeowner in the house that I saw in Malibu did, where that house survived and the other ones were completely decimated. So this would work in Idaho. It works across the West. I think we've shown that we can't control when wildfires start. So if we acknowledge that, then what we can control is how we build, how we live, and how we work with other community members.
Before I let you go, the podcast dropped yesterday. So what else are we going to be able to hear over the next couple of episodes?
Yeah, so the first episode is really what happened on the night of the Palisades Fire. And, we follow various different community brigade members as they're doing evacuation, as they're doing structure defense, kind of as the night unfolds. The second episode is about why it mattered. And so this really looks at the rebuilding process, the aftermath, kind of bringing the discussion forwards. And I think that second episode really has a lot of news you can use, information about how the community brigade model works, about what home hardening is, and just sort of, big scale picture. How can we start to move the needle on the wildfire issue?
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this. We've been speaking with reporter and host Adriana Cargill about her new podcast, The Palisades Fire, the untold story of everyday people Rewriting How We Live with Wildfire. As we mentioned, it dropped yesterday. We're going to put a link to the podcast as well as some pictures on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, I'm Peter Pruitt from Zoo Idaho.
And I'm Dr. Leif Tapinola with the Idaho Museum of Natural History.
Together we host The Nature of Idaho, a podcast all about how our state's amazing landscapes, wildlife, and geology shape life here in the Gem State.
Each week we dive into nature stories from across Idaho, everything from fossils to forests, and sometimes even a few fun facts you can share on your next hike.
So join us as we celebrate everything that makes wild Idaho special.
Listen to The Nature of Idaho from KISU, wherever you get your podcasts, or at KISU.org.